Hey everyone, and welcome to the Retro channel. This right here is my Commodore 128D, and as you can probably hear, or not hear, it is silent. Today we're going to have a look at how to change out the power supply in one of these and go from a really noisy old beast to a quiet, beautiful machine. A couple of other housekeeping items before we get started. I have gone back to my lavalier mic, so hopefully the audio quality has improved versus the last few videos. I was trying to get away with not using a lavalier mic, but it turns out that's just not really possible if you want good audio quality and don't have a big expensive, boom mic or whatever. So that's that. The other thing I wanted to mention is Mr. Lurch, aka Jason of Mr. Lurch's Things, has just jumped up to the Captain Blood tier. So a massive shout out and thank you to Mr. Lurch. Obviously, if you haven't seen the channel, check out Mr. Lurch's Things. I'll put links down below. Let's do it. So this is my Commodore 128D. I did buy this off eBay quite a few months ago, so I'm pretty sure the listing is dead, but it was sold at the time as strictly for parts only, which to me is just a challenge to say, I bet you can't fix it. So I bought it and I fixed it. And at this point, it powers on, everything appears to work, but there are a couple of little issues that I still need to sort out. And the first one is the most obvious one. If we just power it on, I'll turn the monitor on too. So it seems to boot up normally, and once the CRT warms up, we get an image, so that is all good. But the fan in this thing is just noisy as hell. It may not be picked up as well on the microphone that I'm wearing, but we'll switch to the onboard camera microphone. And whether or not that's any different, I don't know. But yeah, the fan is really annoying, and it's at the point where I don't really want to use the machine because the fan just annoys the crap out of me. So what I want to do is swap out the power supply. Now I could of course just swap out the fan, and I might turn this off. I could of course swap out the fan and that would solve the noisy fan issue. Like a Noctua fan would probably be, whisper quiet. But it also has a very old power supply in it. I can see when I first opened this up, this thing had had a lot of use over its years. It was also missing a lot of the original screws, and it was in pretty rough condition. I did, however, clean it up. The first thing I did when I got it was actually open up the power supply and clean that out. And it sort of worked when I first turned it on. The actual switch on the side isn't very good. I might just unplug the mains power. So it's very mushy. So the other thing I want to do today is replace that switch. Now I think the reason it was sold as for parts only is because the switch was so bad and it looked like the contacts were arcing. In fact, when I first turned it on, it sort of arced a little bit and the machine sort of powered on and off a few times, so that wasn't a good sign. And I think that's where whoever had it previously just went, it's got major issues. And yeah, it's just a bad power switch. So I want to swap out the switch and also swap out the power supply for something more modern and that doesn't need a fan. Now I do of course want to measure not only temperatures inside the machine before and after, but we're also going to have a look at the image quality and also the audio quality, because a switching power supply can have or generate interference with the video and audio signals. So we'll check out a before and after of that. I've already taken the before samples of the image quality and the audio quality. And that's just with turning the SID volume up to the max, not actually playing anything through it, just listening for the difference in the signal to noise ratio, I guess you'd call it. So we'll check that out, but first up, let's take a look at what power supply is going in. So this is what I'm going to replace the power supply in the 128D with. It is a Meanwell RD50A, rated at 5 volts, 6 amps, and 12 volts, 2 amps. So more than enough to keep this thing happy. I think the 128D, The 5 volts is rated at 3.5 amps, I want to say, and the 12 volts I think is 1.5 amps. So yeah, definitely enough juice in this to keep the 128D happy. And here is a switch that I bought off AliExpress. So this is a switch I got off AliExpress. It looked like the dimensions would fit, so hopefully that'll work. But yes, it's nice and clicky. So new switch, new power supply, and I also plan to do some other upgrades to this machine, but I want to sort out these two major components first before I go spending more time fiddling with other stuff. So let's whip off the case and take a look. And by the way, this is the keyboard that I actually had to source separately because it didn't come with the machine, and yeah, pretty yellow. But unfortunately, we haven't had much of a summer here in Australia, so a lot of rain and overcast weather, so I haven't actually retro-brighted this yet. And I've got to source another key. Ugh. So I've already removed the case screws, and these didn't come with the machine either. So yeah, I found some little metal machine screws. So the case should just open up once we open up the handle. And there we go. So yeah, this power plug actually is screwed into the top part of the case. So I'm just going to kind of set that over to the side here. And here's the machine. The disk drive was in pretty rough shape. Now I did actually sort of even it out, because the problem with these 1571 disk drives, because it's got a top head and a bottom head, if you leave it in the open position, it actually causes the top head to tilt to the side, and over time it kind of stays that way. So if you've got one of these 1571 drives, be it in your 128D or just a standalone one, it's recommended to keep the actual drive lever in the closed position so that it doesn't, you know, bend out of shape over time. So that was pretty easy to fix up. It seems to work fine now, but yeah, like I said, this power supply ain't so great. Let's whip it out. All right, so here's our power supply removed from the case. There's our noisy fan. It does have the output currents here and voltages. So 5 volts, 6 amp, which is what this is, 5 volts, 6 amp. 12 volts, 1.4. I've got 12 volts, 2 amps. So should be fine. I don't think during normal operation it will actually use 6 amps. It's usually if you've got, say, the RAM expansion and a bunch of other expansions probably, that you're going to use that full 6 amps. Let's just open it up and take a look inside. Now, keep in mind I have already cleaned this out. When I first got this, the power supply looked like an old computer, you know, ATX power supply. So full of dust, like absolutely caked in the stuff. So yeah, like I said, it's seen a lot of use, that's for sure. We're going to keep the AC transformer because it still supplies the SID chip, and I think it still supplies the VIC chip in this particular revision. So that's going to provide a nice clean output for them, which then gets regulated by a linear voltage regulator on the board. But yeah, everything else is powered from this switch mode portion. So we're going to be replacing a switch mode with a switch mode, so I'm not expecting any major issues. The only thing to obviously work out is just how we're going to mount this in here. Just make sure any of these larger caps, like this 400 volt one, are discharged. Oh, it actually had 49 volts in it, possibly more. So yeah, that probably would have been enough to give me a shock. Yeah, that's fine. 8 volts, 8 volts. All of this stuff over here should be, you know, low 35 volts. So yeah, no issues there. But yeah, that probably would have hurt a little bit if I had touched the terminals. All right, so here we are. After a couple of hours and a good amount of swearing, everything is reassembled and I think ready to go. So the Meanwell power supply is installed. This is actually going to have to sit in the top part of the case like that. So this is top, bottom's here. So ventilation, I'm not 100% certain on, but we've got the thermal cam, so we can always check it out. I've put an inline fuse in here, along with the new power switch, nice and clicky. Heat shrink wherever you can, grommets wherever there's sharp edges to be had. And yeah, everything seems to fit back in, no problemos. So yeah. AC comes in, obviously goes through, active goes through the switch, through the fuse, into our Meanwell, which also doubles as a little junction point for our transformer. Neutral comes in, Meanwell, transformer. Both of those come out of the secondary and are wired to these orange wires here, and I've thrown some heat shrink on them and stuck them together. And of course, we've got our ground connection, which goes to the Meanwell, which grounds all the case. We've got our 5-volt outputs over here, which are all the red wires. So there's one for the disk drive and one for the main board, and black, obviously ground, and the yellow, which is 12 volts for the disk drive connection, all hooked up. Yeah, I replaced this cord. This was the original one, so I just left the switch on there and don't need this connector anymore. And of course, we've got the original power supply, which, yeah, it doesn't look too bad. There is, if you look really carefully, there are a couple of little areas deep down in there where I didn't actually manage to clean out all the dust and gunk. But yeah, it was completely caked in the stuff. That's it. Obviously, fan can stay out, hopefully. Otherwise, I'll be putting a better fan in if required. But yeah, these just sit back in like this, and cover just goes back on like so. Sans fan. So before we get too carried away, I'll just hook this up and give it a little test run, make sure our voltages look good, and then we'll stick it all back together, I guess. All right, so power is plugged in. I haven't plugged it into the disk drive or the main board yet, but I just want to flick the switch just to see what happens. If anything's going to happen, the fuse might blow. I actually put a 2 amp fuse in there. Commodore had a 3.15 amp in the original power supply, so figure 2 amps should be more than enough. 3.15 seems rather on the high side, but maybe the inrush current will trip the fuse. Maybe I've completely screwed something up, but I've like double, triple checked this, so should work. All right, here we go. So I hear a buzz. Let's just hook everything up and see what it does. At first I thought something was wrong, but that's because I'm so used to hearing that fan. Seems fine. Let's check voltages. So it should be these two orange. 10.7 volts AC, that seems fine. Our 5-volt rail is showing 5.03. I'm pretty happy with that. And the 12 volt, if I can do this without shorting anything. 12.28. I've got the probe switched around, but yeah, that's fine. Cool. We'll hook up a monitor. Well, there's something I didn't count on. These two screws are too tall. They don't let the case sit flat. I'll have to find some alternatives. Alright, so I swapped out the screws and had to make some very minor adjustments to the case. Just basically drilled out a little bit of plastic, but not so much that it's visible from the top side. And now it fits. So I can finally, again, reassemble this thing and give it a proper test run. Alright, so the machine has been up and running for about an hour now, and I haven't noticed any issues at all, apart from trying to play Mario with a joystick. So we'll take a look inside and see what the temperatures look like. I do want to get some heat sinks on some of the ICs because they're no doubt cooking at the moment. This machine did actually come with the RF shield, but it was bent out of shape and rusted. They pretty much just threw everything in this machine because I guess they thought it was junk. So yeah, the RF shield's long gone, but we will heat sink whatever chips are getting hot. So yeah, let's open this up and take a closer look on the inside. I did already test out the difference in audio noise. So with the original power supply and the new power supply, there's practically no difference. There is a different sort of sound to the noise, but even boosting it by 40 decibels, just so I could hear what it sounded like, which I'll play now. So the first couple of seconds was with the original power supply and the other half was the new power supply. There is a different sounding noise, but yeah, the actual noise floor is around minus 50 decibels either way. So yeah, it's pretty much as quiet as a SID's gonna get, probably. So yeah, let's open this up and have a look at some temperatures. All right, so thermal cam's out. Let's take the lid off and take a look. Now it is still running Mario, so I've kept it running. So I expect it to be fairly warm in here after this much time. First thing we'll check out is just the power supply. And the case of the power supply is at about 27, 28, 26 degrees. So it is a little bit warmer than before, but nothing dramatic. I think it was 23 degrees before. But yeah, if we go back out a little bit, certainly some of these ICs are getting quite warm. So this here, which I think is the MMU, one of these, in fact, both of these are quite warm. They're just blocked by the cable. So these two ICs pretty much, yeah, all these dips are quite warm. Now the VIC and the VDC are inside the can, so that's going to stay there because that's acting as a good heat sink for them. And yeah, most of the ICs on the disk drive are actually quite warm as well. So I'm going to go around and just yeah, stick some heat sinks on these. Hopefully I've got enough of them. There are quite a few things. So I'm just going to clean the top of the chips first. The computer is still running, and that had like some kind of pen mark or something on top of it. And once it's clean and dry, we just stick a little heatsink on. Not going to worry about trying to cover the whole IC with heat sinks, just the middle where the die is. That should be more than enough. And then, yeah, rinse and repeat. This is our SID. This one's a 6581 R4AR. Yeah, this had a dead SID, and I think I had an ARM SID in it briefly, but I've swapped it out since. A little regulator's quite toasty there, the 7812. And oh, that's the MMU. What's that? I don't remember. Doesn't matter. Everything gets heat sinks. Yeah, that regulator, I mean, Commodore didn't stick it down to the board, but it does get quite toasty. I'm just going to power it off. Perhaps I can fit a heatsink on here. Yeah, I think so. I was curious if the bridge rectifier got hot, but it doesn't seem to get warm at all. There are a couple more things under the disk drive, so I'm going to have to remove it, I guess. Yep, the 6510, or it's an 8520 in this, the Z80 and the other CIA can all use heat sinks too. Right, and I think that is it. So it is heat sinks galore, but because I've got the thermal cam, I can see what's getting hot and what's not. So not everything got a heat sink on it, but I mean, if you're doing this without a thermal cam, I'd just, you know, slap a heat sink on everything. It doesn't hurt. Right, I'm happy with how things are looking. This is the disk drive board and everything else looks fine. This is probably the warmest thing at the moment, and that's 40 degrees. These, the thermal cam doesn't pick them up properly. I have to change the setting. So although they look cold, it's actually just because of the material that they're made from. The thermal cam thinks they're cold, but they're actually, I mean, barely warm, but certainly warmer than, what is it saying? 26 degrees. Yeah, I think they're a little bit warmer than that. Cool. Finally, all of this is going to be put back together for now, until next time. So, what have we learnt from all this? Well, first of all, you can change out the power supply in this to a Meanwell RD50A and it will work just fine and still run fairly cool. You also want to heatsink any ICs wherever possible in pretty much any machine. For the Commodore machines, if you've got that metal RF shield, that acts as a heatsink. So if you're keeping that, then you should be fine. Maybe replace the thermal paste. But if you're getting rid of the RF shield, then you definitely want to install some heat sinks. The fan in this machine is obviously non-existent now, but you could, of course, as I said, swap it out for a quieter fan. In this case, you know, it makes no noise at all anymore, so unless I'm actually looking at it, I don't know if it's actually turned on anymore, which is kind of weird from going from hearing it being obviously on to complete silent. Would I recommend changing out the power supply? Probably only if you've got experience playing with mains power and if you're really desperate to get rid of the old power supply, but honestly I'd probably just change out the fan if you're happy with that and the power supply is working. That, I think, is about it. I do want to do some further upgrades to this machine, but that'll wait for another video. I want to add some extra RAM for the VDC, and there are a couple of other things that I had in mind that I can't think of right now. So anyway, we're going to leave it here. As always, thank you for watching the Retro channel. A massive thanks to the people that support me on Patreon and YouTube memberships. And yeah, I will catch you in the next one. Feel free to like, comment, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, that's it for me. Bye. Always gets me.